There are cities that remember their violence in monuments and memorials, and there are cities that remember it in silence. Palermo remembers it in silence. Not because the events were too small to matter, but because the forces that shaped them were too large to comfortably name. Because the dead numbered in the hundreds before any official body acknowledged the pattern. Because, by the time investigators began to count, the counting itself had become a political act. The Second Mafia War in Sicily did not begin with a declaration. It did not begin with a single act that could be pointed to and said, "Here, this is where it started." It began the way institutional failures always begin, gradually, then completely, with small decisions made by men in rooms that no official record would ever describe, with structures already in place, with power already arranged. What followed between 1981 and 1983 was, in the assessment of investigators and historians who have examined it most closely, among the most lethal internal conflicts in the history of organized crime on European soil. Later estimates range widely, often in the high hundreds, sometimes more. The number remains imprecise. Not all the bodies were found. Not all the deaths were counted. Some victims were never recovered, not by accident. According to later investigative reconstructions, some were buried in unmarked ground. Some simply disappeared, in the way that people disappear when no one in authority is looking, or when those in authority have decided not to look. This is not a story about monsters. It is a story about a system, about how power consolidates, about what institutions do when confronted with organized violence of that scale, and why the responses were so consistently, so structurally inadequate. To understand what happened, it is necessary to understand what Sicily was and what Cosa Nostra had become. The island had been shaped by centuries of foreign occupation, Spanish rule, Bourbon rule, a northern Italian unification that many in Sicily experienced not as liberation, but as a different form of domination. Tax collection, conscription, land seizure, the instruments of distant governance that arrived without explanation and left without accountability. Into that space, in the second half of the 19th century, a different kind of governance emerged. Not official, not recognized, but functional, in the particular way that informal systems become functional when formal ones fail. The organization that would later call itself Cosa Nostra, our thing, began as something closer to a network of rural enforcers, men who mediated disputes, managed access to land and water, maintained order in areas where no court's writ reliably ran. Over generations, the structure formalized, territorial units called mandamenti, local leadership structures called families, or cosce, an overarching coordinating body, the commissione, the commission that emerged across the 20th century to manage relations between the clans and prevent the kind of internal conflict that would attract unwanted external attention. The logic was essentially rational. Violence was expensive. It drew scrutiny. A mafia that fought with itself was a mafia that could be seen. And a mafia that could be seen could be prosecuted. The commission existed to contain that violence, to adjudicate disputes, to ensure that the collective interest of the organization was not sacrificed to the particular ambitions of any single faction. For a period, that logic held. And then it didn't. The late 1970s brought new money to Cosa Nostra, enormous money, the heroin trade, which the organization had been managing in various capacities since the 1950s, had by the late 1970s become a global industry of extraordinary scale. Sicilian traffickers were not merely local suppliers. They were, according to later investigations by American and Italian authorities, central nodes in a transatlantic pipeline moving heroin from Southeast Asian sources through processing operations in Sicily to distribution networks in the United States. The operation would eventually be designated, in American federal prosecutorial language, the Pizza Connection. The name was convenient, the scale was not. The revenues from this trade were transformative. They created, within Cosa Nostra, a new class of men with resources vastly exceeding those of their predecessors. And resources, in any organization, produce ambition. The family from Corleone, a town in the Sicilian interior, Approximately 60 kilometers from Palermo had never been the most prominent family in the Commission's hierarchy. Palermo was the center. The coastal families held the institutional weight, the established relationships, the historical authority. But the Corleonesi operated differently. Their leadership figures, including Luciano Leggio and subsequently Salvatore Riina, had been shaped by decades of internal exile and fugitive existence. Riina had been a fugitive from Italian justice since the 1960s. He would remain one until his capture in 1993. He did not run his organization from a position of comfort. He ran it from concealment. According to the testimony of multiple former Cosa Nostra members, who later cooperated with investigators the Pentiti, those who repented and spoke, Riina was not simply brutal. Brutality alone does not build empire. He was methodical, strategic, willing to accept short-term costs for long-term structural advantage. He understood, before many of his rivals did, that the new money from heroin had created a moment of instability that could be exploited. What he did with that understanding would reshape the entire organization. The war did not begin without warning. There had been an earlier period of internal violence, the first Mafia war of the early 1960s, that had already demonstrated the Commission's limits when factional stakes were high enough. That conflict had eventually resolved into a new equilibrium, a peace maintained, uneasily, through the 1970s. The triggering event that most investigators identify as the beginning of the Second Mafia War was the murder of Stefano Bontate on April 23, 1981. Bontate was not a peripheral figure. He was the boss of the Santa Maria di Gesù family, one of the most significant in Palermo. He was well-connected, a man who navigated the overlap between criminal organization, legitimate business, and political relationship with considerable skill. He represented the old order, the established hierarchy, the Palermo-centered balance of power that had prevailed since the first Mafia war. He was shot dead in his car. The date was his birthday. Weeks later, Salvatore Inzerillo, another significant Palermo boss, head of the Passo di Rigano family, a man with deep connections to American organized crime and to the heroin pipeline, was also killed. The manner of his death, according to court records from subsequent prosecutions, was designed to be read as a statement, a wad of cash placed in the wound, a message about what happens to men who had grown too comfortable with their wealth. These two killings, in rapid succession, announced the scope of what was beginning. What followed was systematic in a way that separated it from conventional organized crime violence. The Corleonesi strategy, as reconstructed from the testimony of cooperating witnesses and from the findings of anti-mafia investigators, was not simply to eliminate rival bosses. It was to eliminate the network, the allies, the relatives, the associates, the men who might harbor loyalty to the old hierarchy or who might, if allowed to survive, eventually organize resistance. This strategy has a name in the testimony of former members. They called it decapitation. And then, when the heads were gone, the strategy extended downward to the bodies of the organizations, to the soldiers, to anyone whose continued existence represented a potential threat or whose elimination served as a signal to others. A boss would be killed, then his brother, then his son, then the men who had worked alongside him for years, then men who had simply been seen in his company at the wrong moment. The logic was not always personal. Often, according to what cooperating witnesses later described, the logic was preventive, the elimination of potential future problems before those problems could materialize. Seen in isolation, each death appeared to be criminal violence of the kind Italy had documented before. The pattern would only become visible later. The families of those killed did not have the luxury of waiting for patterns. A man would leave his house in the morning and not return. His wife would make inquiries that produced no answers. His children would learn, quickly, that asking questions was itself a form of danger. The practice of omerta, the code of silence, was not an abstract cultural phenomenon. It was a survival calculation made by people who understood what happened when they spoke. Some families lost multiple members across a matter of weeks, fathers and sons, killed in the same campaign. Brothers killed within days of each other. The Inzerillo family, beyond the boss himself, lost additional members in the consolidation that followed. In some cases, young men who had left Sicily for the United States found their fathers, uncles, and cousins killed in their absence. Some were subsequently warned not to return. The scale of this was known in Palermo neighborhoods in real time. It was not known, with anything approaching the same granularity, in the institutions nominally responsible for confronting it. The institutional response during the war itself was, and this is documented in parliamentary inquiries, in judicial proceedings, in the reports of anti-mafia investigators, inadequate in ways that require careful characterization. It would be imprecise to say that Italian authorities did nothing. Police and carabinieri made arrests. Prosecutors opened investigations, but the machinery of the state was not designed for what it was confronting. Consider the specific mechanisms of that inadequacy. Italian organized crime law in 1981 did not yet recognize the criminal organization as an entity in itself. A prosecutor confronting the Second Mafia War had to construct each case around individual acts, a specific murder, a specific drug transaction, without the legal tools to address the enterprise that ordered and coordinated those acts. The organizational reality of Cosa Nostra existed outside the law's field of vision. Consider also the jurisdictional structure. Sicily's investigative responsibility was divided among multiple offices: the Procura of Palermo, the Procura of Trapani, the Procura of Agrigento, each with territorial authority over different mandamenti. Palermo saw one piece, Trapani saw another, Agrigento saw a third. No single office was built to see the whole. Evidence developed in one jurisdiction was not automatically shared with another. The pattern visible across all of it was invisible inside any one part. That wasn't bad luck. It was the terrain. Consider what happened to investigative personnel who pressed too hard. Manuel Basile, a carabinieri captain who had been building cases against Corleonesi-linked figures, was shot dead in Monreale in May 1980. His replacement did not inherit his investigation intact. The institutional knowledge he had accumulated died with him, or was dispersed. These were not isolated incidents. They were the elimination of investigative capacity, targeted and repeated. And consider the broader political environment in which all of this was operating. Italy's post-war Christian Democratic Party had managed Sicilian electoral politics for decades through arrangements that required the cooperation of local power structures. Those power structures were not entirely separate from Cosa Nostra. Votes were delivered, contracts were awarded, relationships were maintained. The men responsible for confronting the Mafia were operating inside a political system that had, in various configurations, accommodated it. This is documented terrain. It is not allegation. Parliamentary inquiries and judicial proceedings established, across the decades that followed, that some political figures had maintained relationships with Cosa Nostra that compromised the institutional response. The precise nature and extent of those relationships has been the subject of ongoing legal and historical dispute, and courts have reached varying conclusions about specific individuals. What can be said with confidence is this: the institutional response to the Second Mafia War was shaped not only by legal inadequacy and jurisdictional fragmentation, but by a political environment in which the Mafia was, for some in positions of influence, an entity to be managed rather than destroyed. The killing attracted journalists. It attracted some investigators with the clarity of purpose to push through institutional resistance. And it eventually attracted two figures whose work would define Italian anti-mafia law enforcement for a generation. Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino were both Sicilian-born prosecutors who joined the investigating magistracy in Palermo. By the early 1980s, they were working within a coordinating unit, the so-called anti-mafia pool, attempting to do something that had not been done before at that scale, to map the organizational structure of Cosa Nostra comprehensively, using evidence gathered from individual cases to construct a picture of the whole. The approach was methodical. It required patience of a specific kind. the patience to build cases not for individual prosecutions, but for a mass prosecution that would address the organization as an organization, not merely its criminal acts as individual events. What made this possible, in a way it had not been before, was the emergence of cooperating witnesses, the pentiti. The first significant cooperator was Tommaso Buscetta. Buscetta was not a minor figure seeking leniency. He was a senior Cosa Nostra member with deep knowledge of the organization's structure, history, and operation. His decision to cooperate with investigators, specifically with Falcone in 1984, came after devastating personal loss. Multiple family members had been killed in the purges of the Second Mafia War. The Corleonesi had targeted his network. He had survived. Much of what he cared about had not. His cooperation, according to the subsequent judicial record, was extraordinary in scope. He provided a systematic account of Cosa Nostra's structure, the families, the mandamenti, the commission, the rules, the rituals, the decision-making processes. He described how the commission worked, how decisions to kill were made, who held authority over what. Buscetta stated that the violence of the Second Mafia War represented a fundamental violation of Cosa Nostra's own internal rules, that what the Corleonesi had done was not simply warfare, it was a coup, a takeover achieved through the systematic elimination of anyone who might oppose it, dressed in the language of organizational discipline but actually representing the destruction of the organization's existing governance structure. Investigators regarded Buscetta's testimony with the appropriate care it required. He was, after all, a man with obvious interests of his own. His account was cross-referenced against documentary evidence, against physical evidence from crime scenes, against the accounts of other cooperating witnesses who emerged in subsequent years. The picture that emerged was not dependent on any single source. It was corroborated, tested, and refined across years of investigation and prosecution. The Maxi trial, Il Maxi Processo, began in Palermo in 1986. 475 defendants, charges that addressed not merely specific crimes, but membership in Cosa Nostra itself, which was now legally recognized as a criminal organization in its own right. The trial took place in a specially constructed bunker courthouse, a physical reminder of the extraordinary security requirements that prosecuting Cosa Nostra demanded. The 1980s had seen not only the mass killings of the Mafia War, but the targeted elimination of investigators, magistrates, and police officers who had pursued the organization too effectively. Giorgio Boris Giuliano, the head of Palermo's mobile police squad, shot in a bar in July 1979. Cesare Terranova, a magistrate and parliamentary deputy who had spent years investigating the Mafia, shot in October 1979. Gaetano Costa, the chief prosecutor of Palermo, shot in August 1980. Pio La Torre, a Communist Party politician who had been pushing for new anti-mafia legislation, shot in April 1982. Each death was a message and a mechanism, a message about the cost of pressing too hard, and a mechanism the removal of a specific person whose knowledge, authority, or persistence represented a structural threat to the organization. The murder of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa in September 1982 was of particular significance. Dalla Chiesa had been appointed prefect of Palermo in the spring of 1982. He had a demonstrated record against the Red Brigades, the left-wing terrorist organization that had conducted political violence throughout Italy in the 1970s and was publicly positioned as the figure who would bring that same focus to the Mafia. He arrived in Palermo with that mandate. He did not arrive with the resources the mandate required. In a letter to a friend, written in the months before his death, Dalla Chiesa reportedly described his situation with a precision that was also a warning. He had been sent, he wrote, to do a job. He had not been given what he needed to do it. The powers he had been promised had not materialized. The support from Rome had not followed the announcement. Whether the failure to equip him was deliberate or simply the result of institutional inertia has been the subject of significant historical analysis. The outcome is documented. He was killed, with his wife Emanuela Sedi Carraro and their driver Domenico Russo, in Via Carini On the night of September 3, 1982, he had been in his position fewer than 100 days. The public response to Dall'Chiesa's murder was of a different order from the public response to earlier killings. Perhaps because he was a general, not a magistrate. Perhaps because his wife died with him, on an ordinary street, in an ordinary car. Perhaps because the letter he had written was made public and the letter made it impossible to claim that the institutional failure was unknowable in advance. The parliamentary response was the Rononi Latorre Law, legislation that created, for the first time in Italian law, the specific crime of Mafia association. That allowed the seizure of assets of suspected Mafia members even without direct evidence linking those assets to specific crimes. Latorre himself had been killed before the law bearing his name was passed. He had been proposing similar legislation for years. The change came after the deaths that made the need undeniable, not before. The Maxi trial concluded in December 1987. 346 defendants were convicted. 19 received life sentences. The verdicts were later upheld after significant legal maneuvering by Italy's highest court. The path to confirmation was not smooth. In 1991, an appeal court in Palermo had significantly reduced the convictions. The legal reasoning behind those reductions was questioned by many observers. Italy's Supreme Court ultimately confirmed the original verdicts in 1992. By that point, the men who had built the case were running out of time. Giovanni Falcone was killed on May 23, 1992, on the highway between Palermo's airport and the city. A massive explosive charge, placed in a culvert beneath the road, was detonated as his convoy passed. He died with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, also a magistrate, and 3 members of his security escort. Paolo Borsellino was killed 57 days later, on July 19, 1992. A car bomb detonated outside the apartment building in Via di Emilio where his mother lived. As he arrived for a visit, he died with 5 members of his police escort. The scale of these attacks, not merely the killing of senior prosecutors, but the killing of their colleagues and protectors, in broad daylight, in major Italian cities, represented something qualitatively different from the internal violence of the Mafia war. It was Cosa Nostra, under Riina's direction, in direct armed confrontation with the Italian state. The conventional wisdom within the organization had always been that killing judges and politicians drew consequences too severe to justify. The violence of 1992 represented either a calculation that those consequences could be managed, or a decision that the threat was severe enough to act regardless of consequences. And there is a question the record does not settle. The period between 1992 and 1993 saw additional bombings in mainland Italy in Florence, Rome, and Milan targeting cultural institutions, including the Uffizi Gallery. These attacks killed additional people and damaged irreplaceable art. Their strategic logic has been the subject of extensive judicial and historical analysis. What is confirmed is that the bombings occurred, that Cosa Nostra members were convicted in connection with them, and that they coincided with a period of significant political crisis in Italy. The Tangentopoli investigations were dismantling much of the post-war political class, and the protection networks that had insulated the organization for decades were under severe pressure. What is alleged by some cooperating witnesses and by some prosecutors is that the bombing campaign was intended to force the Italian state into political negotiations, and that some form of informal contact took place between representatives of the organization and elements of the Italian security apparatus during this period. What remains disputed is the nature, extent, and consequence of any such contacts. Multiple judicial proceedings have examined these allegations over decades. Some verdicts have been reached, subsequently challenged on appeal, revised, and appealed again. The proceedings have not produced a settled account that commands consensus among legal scholars, historians, or investigators. This uncertainty is itself part of the record. It suggests either a genuine complexity of evidence that courts have struggled to resolve, or a persistent resistance in the institutional environment to fully documenting what occurred. Either way, the record remains incomplete. Rina was arrested in January 1993. He had been a fugitive for 23 years. He was found in Palermo, not in some remote location, but living in the city itself. How he had remained undetected for so long, in a city where the security services were nominally looking for him, became a question that generated its own investigations, its own disputed findings, its own incomplete answers. He died in prison in 2017, having never cooperated with investigators, having been convicted in multiple trials for multiple murders, including those of Falcone and Borsellino. The legacy of the Second Mafia War is not reducible to body counts, though the body counts were significant. Conservative estimates place the death toll between 1981 and 1983 at approximately 1,000. Some analyses suggest higher numbers, accounting for deaths that were attributed to other causes or never officially connected to the conflict. The uncertainty is itself part of the record. What the war produced, structurally, was a Cosa Nostra remade in the image of those who had won it, the Corleonesi, having eliminated the existing leadership hierarchy, installed their own. The commission was reconstituted under their control. The families that had resisted were absorbed or destroyed. For a period, this produced a different kind of organization, more centrally controlled, more willing to deploy spectacular violence, less constrained by the traditional norms that had made Cosa Nostra relatively cautious in its confrontations with the state. The violence of 1992 was an expression of that transformed organization, and that violence produced consequences that even the most strategic calculation had not fully anticipated. The Italian state, under sustained public pressure, expanded the legal tools available to prosecutors. The 41 bis prison regime, which placed convicted mafia members under conditions of severe isolation designed to prevent them from continuing to direct organizational activities from prison, was expanded and made permanent. Collaborating witness protections were strengthened. New investigative techniques were authorized. These measures were not without controversy. Civil libertarians raised legitimate questions about the scope of special prison conditions and their compatibility with human rights standards. These debates have continued in Italian legal and political discourse. They continue now. What the measures produced, operationally, was a sustained disruption of Cosa Nostra's capacity to function as it had functioned in its most powerful period. The organization did not disappear. It adapted. It became more careful. It pursued different revenue streams, different operational methods, different relationships with the economic and political structures around it. But it never again achieved the operational confidence to kill Supreme Court prosecutors and general prefects in the middle of Italian cities. The human cost of the Second Mafia War has tended, in most accounts, to be expressed through the institutional figures, the prosecutors and generals and politicians whose deaths are documented and memorialized. The less visible cost is harder to quantify and easier to forget. In the neighborhoods of Palermo where the war was fought, between 1981 and 1983, children learned specific rules, not written down, not formally taught, but learned, quickly and thoroughly. You did not ask where a neighbor had gone. You did not ask why the car on the corner was no longer there. You did not repeat at school what you heard at home. You learned to read the street, to read faces, to understand which silences required your participation. Women whose husbands had been killed often had no official recourse. To report the death was to identify yourself as connected to one side or the other. To seek justice was to draw attention. To grieve publicly was to invite scrutiny. Some families buried men who had been declared missing by the organization and were, in the bureaucratic record, still alive. The legal and financial consequences of that ambiguity in terms of property, inheritance, social benefit fell on families already devastated by loss. The sociological literature on what sustained exposure to this kind of violence does to communities is extensive and consistent. It documents the erosion of civic trust, the retreat of public engagement, the privatization of grief. It describes communities in which the capacity for collective action for the kind of organized civic life that democracy requires is systematically degraded by the presence of organized violence. Grief became administrative, fear became routine. This damage was not incidental, it was functional. Communities that cannot trust each other, cannot organize, cannot speak are communities that cannot resist. Palermo has changed significantly since the worst of the violence. The city has seen urban renewal, cultural revitalization, the growth of civil society organizations dedicated to anti-mafia advocacy and victim support. The change is documented and real. It would also be imprecise to suggest that the dynamics that made the war possible have been fully resolved. The structural conditions, economic marginalization, the persistence of informal power networks, the ongoing question of the relationship between official and unofficial authority have not been eliminated by legal reform or institutional change. In 2023, Matteo Messina Denaro, the last of the major Corleonesi-era fugitives, a man who had been on the run from Italian justice for 30 years, was captured in a private clinic in Palermo, where he had been receiving treatment for cancer under a false name. He died in prison later that year. His capture ended a chapter. What follows in terms of the organization's structure, its leadership, its operational capacity is a matter of ongoing law enforcement concern, not settled historical record. Giovanni Falcone, in the years before his death, said that the Mafia was not invincible, that it had a beginning, and therefore could have an end. But he also said the end was not inevitable, that it required a sustained commitment from institutions that had shown, across the long historical record, a persistent tendency to accommodate rather than confront. He understood that he was working inside those institutions. He understood their limits from the inside. That clarity did not change the outcome. The legal architecture he helped build outlasted him. Prosecutorial methods, frameworks for addressing criminal enterprises as organizations, witness protection systems, institutional knowledge accumulated at personal cost. Whether the institutions that hold that architecture are equal to the demands placed on them is a question the historical record does not answer. It poses it with considerable persistence. The silence in which Palermo holds its memory is not the silence of forgetting. It is the silence of a city that learned, across a very long period, that naming certain things carried consequences, and that is learning, slowly and imperfectly, what it means to speak. What that transition costs, and what it requires, remains unresolved. The answers are still being written in courts, still sitting, in investigations still open, in communities still working out what justice looks like when the crime was also the system.